Marilyn Laszlo was a missionary to Papua New Guinea, sent by the Wycliffe Bible translators. My name is Dennis Gitonga, and I'm here to tell you her story. Welcome. While just a little girl of the age of 5, Marilyn felt a call to be a missionary. And of course, she took the normal life stages of schooling, and then for her master's program, she decided to take linguistics at the University of Oklahoma. Soon after this, she joined the Wycliffe Bible translators. And at that time, they sent her to Papua New Guinea. However, she and her partner, who was also her sister, had trouble deciding on which of the more than 700 tribes or language groups they were going to go to in Papua New Guinea. On consultation, the administration proposed that they should go to the Sepik River region or area, where there were many unreached tribes, and yet there had not been much missionary activity. But also, they thought that it was important, because these were two young ladies, to give them a place that would be near enough of an airstrip. So they selected a place called Hauna, or the Hauna village. And this is where the Sepik Iwam people were living. On entry into the area, the two young ladies were met by very curious eyes and very surprised people. For the first time, they were witnessing white people. What kind of people were these? What were they? How had they come? What exactly had brought them to their village? And so Marilyn and her sister tried to introduce themselves and say why they had come. For instance, they said, "We have come to live with you, we have come to learn your language." And of course, all this fell on deaf ears because no one really understood English. But more than that, the people of Hauna village were amazed, and they couldn't just figure out whether these two were male or female. And for about 30 minutes, they took time to discuss amongst themselves. And after those many minutes, decided that these were neither male nor female. Interesting. But however, their journey began in the Hauna village. One of the key responsibilities of missionary when you get to a new land that you're supposed to be a missionary in is for you to take time to learn the language, and possibly, especially as a Bible translator, you have to write that language if it's not written. And so for Marilyn and her friend, they had to take time to actually learn the language and write the alphabet. It was an interesting journey because there were some times they would get it right and times they would get it wrong. For instance, one day she wanted to figure out the name of a house. And so she came and started hitting against the house and trying to sign to the person, to an elderly man who was there, so that he could perhaps get to give her a name. And so after a lot of attempts, finally the man figured out what the lady was asking for. And he shouted, "Omaga." Omaga is the Sepikiwam word for house. And that was the very first word that Marilyn got to write in this language. Now, another instance, she was trying to figure out the name for jumping. Now, this is where things got funny. And so she was jumping in front of this man many times, hoping that he would get what she wanted to hear. And finally, he gave a phrase which she wasn't sure whether this is a phrase or a word. And after writing it down, she thought that was the word for jumping. And of course, going around the village, she was excited to use the new words she was learning. Only, sadly and in a very embarrassing way, to figure out that that word meant, why are you jumping like you are stupid? Or why are you behaving so in such a stupid manner? And so it was not the word for jumping. It was just asking, why are you behaving in a stupid manner? And she was shocked. And from there, she started, of course, getting to learn more of the language as she continued. Now, they had an interesting escapade with food. And of course, in a new area, you get to learn their kind of food. And some of the food was pleasant, some of the food was not pleasant. The other thing that they had to go around was the issue of health. And Marilyn came to discover that these people had very interesting things as far as health was concerned. One, and very sad to say that, was that they would actually bury people alive. But they didn't know that these people were alive. They were burying them after someone had been in a coma. And so a coma to them meant the person is dead, even if they were breathing. It just meant their body is there, but they are no longer there. And so one of these days, while she is in the village, some villagers come to her and they call her. One of the men in the village was in such a situation, and the medicine man who was attending to him was ensuring that nobody comes close, but he wasn't succeeding to get him up. And so when they managed to get around the place, they tried to look for an opportunity until this man, the medicine man, got distracted. And when he got distracted, Marilyn quickly was told to inject the man who was lying there. And after injecting him, she whispered into his ear, "Say Jesus." And she whispered that until at some point this man just sat up and shouted the name Jesus. For the first time, this community had seen someone getting out of a coma. It was a miracle for the whole community. Now, one of the things that happened when Marilyn and her partner landed in the community is that they were given a house to live in. Now, they had been prepared that when you are in this community, there were some key things that you needed to know. One of them is that there were animals, friendly and unfriendly. For instance, the snake, which were among them the pythons, which were not as dangerous. The community would have them around and the kids would be playing around them. However, there was this interesting snake which the community called the mabu. But it had an interesting way of handling or behaving around people. And the thing about it was that it would get around to your mouth and start sucking out saliva from there. That was very, very disgusting. So for that night, they decided they were going to have a net or a mosquito net very well tucked around their bed so that there would be no chance that such a snake would get their way. Sadly, in the morning, they discovered that the mosquito net had been eaten all up on the lower side by the cockroaches. Interestingly, the walls of that house were covered by cockroaches. but asked by many people about her experiences in that community and why she wasn't afraid and why she wasn't feeling like that would not be a safe place for her. She, of course, confesses and says, well, any person would be afraid. Any person would go through such challenges. However, there is this statement that she makes that has stuck with me since the first time I heard her story. And she says, the safest place to be is at the center of God's will for your life. The safest place to be in the world is to be at the center of God's will for your life. And so Marilyn and her partner were helped of God to actually write down the language of this community and gave them about 4 books that were helping them to teach the language to the people. And from that moment, they were able to start a school for the community. They were able to develop a health system for the community. And of course, build a church. Now, during this time of close to actually a quarter of a century in that place, God enabled Marilyn to actually come up with a Bible helped by the community. The first ever New Testament in the language of the Sepik, Iwam people, was written. And that was a great moment for joy as they waited to receive the very first copies of the Bible along the river Sepik. And this is an interesting thing because it calls us to think about, what am I doing with my life? How close am I to the purposes of God? Am I at the center of God's purposes for my life? So that is the story of Marilyn. What's your story?